It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. It's hard to believe that we're already almost to the end of 2022, but that also means that I should probably get some more Universal Classic Monsters involved before we move into a brand new calendar. So this month, I've got a string of 3 Universal Monsters sequels before we finish out with the sort of oddball of the entire franchise. We're getting things started with 1940's The Invisible Woman. Now, I don't think we need to introduce the Universal Classic Monsters, right? I will say, though, that it's not uncommon to hear the term Universal Classic Monster Cycle. The reason for this is that after Universal decided to get back into the monster game in the late 30s after a successful re-release of Frankenstein grossed some pretty decent money for the studio, Universal pretty much cycled through all of their characters, save for one, sort of. But it all kicked off with Son of Frankenstein in 1939. Then 1940 brought The Invisible Man Returns, The Mummy's Hand, and they fast-tracked The Invisible Woman. Then 1941 brought The Wolfman, followed in 1942 with The Ghost of Frankenstein, Invisible Agent, and The Mummy's Tomb. And it goes right back to the start in 1943 with Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman before throwing Son of Dracula in, and then another run of Invisible Man, Mummy, Frankenstein, and Dracula sequels. So you kind of see that there's a somewhat cyclical nature that Universal followed. The cycle came to an end in 1945 with House of Dracula, but still, people talk about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Well, Universal Classic Monsters had a 70-year head start on that franchise. Now, I mentioned that this film, The Invisible Woman, was fast-tracked, and it certainly was. The Invisible Man Returns was released in January 1940 to fairly favorable reviews and Oscar nomination for Best Visual Effects, and grossed nearly 4 times its budget. So yeah, Universal wanted more of that. But they would try a little cheeky twist, if you will. They hired comedy writers Frederick Rinaldo and Robert Lees to make the movie. Now, Lees would be famous for the Abbott and Costello films, but originally Universal wanted Margaret Sullivan for the titular role since she owed the studio one more film. But she wanted to work on another movie and failed to report to Universal. That all eventually got settled, but it led to veteran actress and singer Virginia Bruce getting the role in this movie. Bruce had previously been in the Academy Award-winning Best Picture of 1936, The Great Ziegfeld, as Audrey Dane. So she came with some decent pedigree. In addition, 2 other recognizable guys showed up in this cast. The first is John Howard, who, up to the point of being in this film, appeared in 7 movies as Captain Hugh Bulldog Drummond after taking over for Ray Milland, who was removed from the role for more important films. The very same year Howard would appear in The Invisible Woman, he'd appear in The Philadelphia Story, which would go on to receive a Best Picture Oscar nomination and would give James Stewart his only Oscar for Best Actor in his entire career. In addition, there was John Barrymore. At this point in time, he was nearing the end of his life and was struggling to memorize lines due to general failing memory. It was said that he had to cut up the script and leave his lines around various places on the set in order for him to find and speak his lines. John Howard said that he was such a nice and likable guy that no one really minded that he had to do this. In fact, he never once looked down on any of these types of films that he made. He was just a fairly normal guy. Of course, the Barrymore name continues in Hollywood to this day through Drew Barrymore. Now, right out of the gate as this movie starts, we understand the tone with the butler walking down the stairs of a mansion and slipping on an empty champagne bottle and everything. This is going to be quite a bit different than the other Universal horror movies that usually came out around this one. But turns out that this is the home of wealthy lawyer Dick Russell, played by John Howard. He spends his money like drinking water. He spends his money on partying. He spends his money on women. He spends his money on funding Professor Gibbs, an old inventor played by John Barrymore, who was originally funded by Dick's father, who keeps ordering supplies and requiring more and more from this wealthy lawyer. His accountant tells Dick that he's got to get rid of all these expenses because he's pretty close to being busted. But after Gibbs gets word that he's cut off, he has to change an ad that he placed in the paper saying that he will not pay a test subject for testing out an invisibility experiment. Gibbs tells Dick that if the experiment works, they will likely make millions from it. But most of the responses that the professor gets are joke responses, calling him a quack and saying, well, if you can make my wife disappear, you can keep her, so on and so forth. But when Dick learns about the invisibility device that he's actually he's getting these requests for, he really thinks the professor is truly nuts. Good news, though, Kitty Carroll is willing to go through with the experiment. Now, speaking of Kitty, we meet this girl who is overly excited to get involved in this experiment. She works as a model for an overbearing boss who underpays and humiliates her. She's generally down on her luck. Now, she shows up for the appointment and is told that she'll only be invisible for a few hours, which is just perfect for her. And Professor Gibbs turns on his machine, and you have the classic Universal scene with a bunch of lab stuff sparking and spinning around and what have you. And the experiment works rather excellently. Kitty decides that she's not going to stick around for Dick to see the results. She's off to get revenge on her boss. That's the whole reason why she wanted to sign up for this. After one of her co-workers and friends seemingly gets fired by her old boss, she decides to have some fun first with the customers by putting on a dress and kind of spooking them. She then goes to her boss's office and gives him a piece of her mind by telling him that she's the voice of his conscience, and she's kind of there to make up for how he treats the models. She has him lean over the windowsill so his head is sticking out the window, and she kicks him in the butt repeatedly. Now, some crooks also get the idea to find the address to Professor Gibbs to get his invisibility machine. One of the crooks is going to pose as a scientist, but Kitty actually spills the beans that he was there with his gang with guns. Of course, being that she's invisible, they didn't see her coming up and returning to the professor's home. Despite running off on the professor and causing extra trouble with Dick, Kitty saving the professor from the crooks basically gets her back on his good side to go through the experiment once more so Dick can see that Gibbs was indeed successful. Unfortunately, Dick leaves to go fishing and the crooks are going to try again to get the machine so their boss in Mexico can basically leave exile and return to see his family in his hometown again. It's a whole thing that he's homesick, basically. It's a fairly goofy subplot, but then again, this is a fairly goofy movie, you have to understand. Now, Gibbs and Kitty decide they're going to turn her invisible and then they're going to go out to Dick's cabin to see him. But she has to remain naked and invisible because, for some reason, Gibbs doesn't want Dick's butler to know that she's there. Why this is, I have no idea, but this mostly is an excuse to have Kitty do or say something that causes the butler to think that he's either hearing things or that the professor has hiccups or sneezing, or later, as he actually sees Kitty pouring a drink for herself, believes that he's seeing ghosts. But because she's cold, Kitty drinks at the cabin. A lot. And she gets real sloppy and gives it to Dick about how he's a playboy and someone who can't handle money or business deals or the women in his life. Now, the next day, Kitty, expecting to be visible again, actually is not. She's still invisible, and the booze that she drank interacted with the invisibility serum that is used before the machine finishes the job. Now, the professor will take her back to his lab, and he'll make her visible again, but there's a bit of a problem. The crooks came and stole the machine. They didn't steal the serum, though, to make the experiment work, so they have to basically come back to get what they need for everything to work on their boss to make him invisible. Gibbs comes up with a reagent to counteract the alcohol in Kitty's system and make her visible again, but shortly after she's able to be seen, the crooks kidnap Gibbs and Kitty, and she finds that this lab in Mexico where they've been taken has a bottle of grain alcohol. She starts gulping it down and, basically, she goes invisible again. She's able to knock out all the goons and freeze the professor, and eventually Dick arrives and gets the pair out of there, and sometime later, we see that Dick and Kitty have a baby, and it turns out that the baby also goes invisible when he comes into contact with rubbing alcohol, proving that Kitty has passed it through in her genes somehow. Now, for the three things that I like about The Invisible Woman, I want to start with how much I just generally enjoy the light entertainment that this movie provides. This is hardly a Universal monster movie, and it's very clear that Lees and Ronaldo was writing a comedy from the start. Indeed, this is just a pleasant movie, and for only about 70 minutes, you're hardly going to regret the time spent. So it's just kind of a little light to put toward this very light comedy that's simply pleasant and hardly offensive at all to watch. Second, John Barrymore is simply fantastic in this. He might have been struggling with his memory, but he's a perfect absent-minded professor. He's just a silly old man, but despite Dick's accountant thinking that he's a quack, he's actually a successful inventor. We see that he's already got a car that drives itself to the garage based on the professor's voice commands. Of course, his invisibility experiment works as well. We wouldn't have a movie if it didn't. And he especially works well on screen opposite his housekeeper, Mrs. Jackson, who's played by Margaret Hamilton. She had just before this had been seen as the Wicked Witch in Wizard of Oz. And she's just doing her job around this house, cleaning up after Gibbs and everything. And he's just so dismissive of her, but she gives just as good as she takes, too. So Barrymore is just kind of playing the perfect absent-minded professor type, and it's just a joy to see him in this type of role, and it really makes this movie that much more likable. Thirdly, I think there's something kind of innocently sultry about this movie. You kind of have to understand that when you can't see Virginia Bruce or any outline of her thanks to clothes, she is indeed supposed to be naked. It is often sort of mentioned that Kitty is indeed kind of bare ass to the world, basically. When she gets sloppy drunk, she collapses, and Dick and Professor Gibbs need to pick her up and take her to bed. And it's not so disguised that it seems that Dick touches a part he probably didn't expect to touch on her because he forgot that she is nude. When she's drunk, and she's also getting a little flirty with Dick, and she talks a lot about being a model and having nice legs and so forth. So let's face it, I mean, Virginia Bruce is easy on the eyes. So now you're kind of thinking about the fact that her character is more or less nude a lot in this movie. It allows for little clever one-liners about being naked and so forth, and it's got a little bit of a mature streak in it for a movie that's released in 1940, well into the Hays Code era. And speaking of streak, I guess technically Kitty Carroll is pretty much streaking the entire movie, huh? But one last thing I will say about The Invisible Woman is that one of the crooks in the movie is played by none other than Shemp Howard. This was during the time he was solo from the Three Stooges and was doing comedic bit parts in Columbia and Universal movies. So while he did a lot of these types of movies, it's still a little bit of a surprise to see him not part of the Stooges. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at FilmSeizure.com. You can also catch new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday morning at FilmSeizure.com. But don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next week, we keep the Universal Classic Monster sequels rolling with the next film in the Mummy series, The Mummy's Tomb. So until next week, stay spooky.